بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وبعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Okay, so in our session tonight, inshallah ta'ala, we're going to look at two sections of the book by Imam al-Bahuti rahimahullah ta'ala. Essentially, we're going to be looking at the excuses which permit foregoing Friday and congregational prayers. And then we're going to look at a section related to prayer of the excused. And that really has to do with prayer while seated. And some of the issues that we touched upon last time will come up in that section in greater detail. So to jump right into this, Imam Bahuti rahimahullah ta'ala, in this chapter, فَصْلٌ فِي الْأَعْذَارِ الْمُبِيحَةِ لِتَرْكِ الْجُمُعَةِ وَالْجَمَاعَةِ, which is basically like chapter dealing with excuses permitting foregoing Friday and congregational prayers. This is not foregoing the prayer in its entirety. Foregoing Friday prayer and prayer in congregation. He says, يُعْذَرُ بِتَرْكِ جُمُعَةٍ وَجَمَاعَةٍ مَرِيضٌ. So it's excusable to forego Friday and congregational prayers due to sickness for someone that is ill. And this is based on the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ foregoing prayer in the masjid when he himself fell ill. And he said, instruct Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu to lead the people in prayer. This hadith is muttafaqun alayh. And this ruling also applies to anyone who fears falling ill. They fear huduth marad. So go back to coronavirus, etc. So they fear falling ill. And this is based on a hadith in which Anas said that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, if anyone hears him who makes the call to prayer and is not prevented from joining the congregation by an excuse, and the Prophet ﷺ was asked what an excuse consisted of, and he replied that it was fear or illness. Fear or illness. So here is fear of illness. He said the prayer, he says, will not be accepted from him, meaning that they hear the adhan and they don't answer it without an excuse. So with an excuse, you're permitted to forego the congregational prayer. Without the excuse, you're not, and this is found in Sunan Abi Dawud. This ruling applies so long as they are not already in the masjid. Meaning someone who is sick or is worried about getting sick, if they're in the masjid, then they have no excuse because they're already there. They have to pray, and so they're obliged to join the congregation. It also applies to anyone who believes their illness will become more severe if they attend, or their recovery is delayed by attending. Jummah is required for anyone who will not sustain harm by attending, be it by riding or being carried. So there's a difference between here congregational prayer and Friday prayer. Okay? When it comes to that issue of illness. So a person is required to attend Jummah prayer so long as they will not sustain harm by attending. Whether they're going to ride there or they're going to be carried there, someone's going to volunteer their transport by helping them board or mount, for example, or is going to take them, or the blind being led by another. This is not the case for congregational prayer. So if you're ill, you're excused, whether there's harm that would be incurred or not. And the difference between the two, the fuqaha say, is that Jummah happens once a week, whereas the congregational prayer happens throughout the day. By the mere fact that it's repeated so often, the congregational prayer in itself has a level of difficulty that the Friday prayer does not. It's also excused for anyone prevented from attending physically capable of doing so, like someone being withheld, like a prisoner. They're unable to attend because they're being withheld, they're being bound, they're not allowed to leave the premises or go to congregations, then they're obviously excused from attending. So Allah says, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. As we know, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse number 286, Allah doesn't burden a soul with more than it can bear. That's the first excuse. The next one is وَمُدَافِعٌ أَحَدُ الْأَخْبَثَيْنِ. So basically we're talking about if someone needs to answer the call of nature. He says foregoing the Jummah and congregational prayer is excused when suppressing either urine or stool. So a person has to go to the restroom and they're like holding that in. So suppressing this need does one or two or both things. Number one, it prevents you from perfecting your prayer. It prevents you from perfecting your prayer. Basically, you're distracted by this pressing, urgent need, and so you're unable to achieve khushu' in the prayer. For that reason, you're excused. You should go and relieve yourself, and then, you can either catch up and join the prayer, or you'll have to pray it on your own. The next one, he says, وَمُحْتَاجٌ لِطَعَامٍ بِحَضْرَتِهِ. Key, وَمُحْتَاجٌ, this is key. A person that needs here, مُحْتَاجٌ لِطَعَامٍ بِحَضْرَتِهِ. بِحَضْرَتِهِ, basically someone that needs food while it's present. They need it while it's present. So basically we're saying foregoing both Jummah and congregational prayer is excused for the hungry. That's the person that needs food, is they're hungry. And food is present. So this is the case when the food is needed and the food is there. Those two things have to be met, those two conditions. It's needed and it's present. And if it is, the person that's hungry is allowed to eat until they're satisfied. Meaning they can sit there and finish until they've reached satisfaction. They don't take a bite. Okay, that's enough. Prayer is being called. It's started. You only get a bite or two or five or whatever, but you're permitted to sit there and eat until satisfied. And this is based on the hadith of Ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma. Reported that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, when dinner is served to any of you and the prayer has been established, begin with dinner and do not rush till you have finished it. This hadith is found in Sahih Muslim. The next one, he says, وَخَائِفٌ ضِيَاءَ مَالِهِ أَوْ فَوَاتَهُ أَوْ ضَرَرًا فِيهِ. Okay, so basically the same thing. Foregoing both Jummah and congregational prayers excused for one who fears the forfeiture, loss, or destruction of their wealth. They're going to forfeit wealth. They're going to lose wealth. Or wealth will be destroyed. And wealth is not just cash and coin here. That is a big part of your wealth, but wealth can be property. And we'll talk about some excuses here. So basically, like crops that have been taken off the vine or have been harvested and they're on the threshing floor. You fear that you might lose that. It could be taken. It could be destroyed if you leave it unsupervised. Or you're worried that an animal would stray. It would wander off. Or your debtor will travel and leave, the person that owes you money. You're worried that if you go, they're going to bolt. Bread or food burning that you left on the fire, or food you left in the oven. That's wealth. You have it on the fire, you have it on the grill, it's on the oven, congregational prayer is called, and you're like, look, if I go to catch the congregational prayer, this is going to burn. And so you're permitted to stay and supervise and make sure things don't get lost. Or like crops being flooded in your absence. You turned on the irrigation for your farm, and you say, look, if I walk away while irrigation's running, by the time I come back, it's likely to flood and that could cause damage to my property. Or the loss of needed livelihood. Needed livelihood, like a wage. It's a needed wage. You require that wage. And if you were to leave the job, then you could lose that needed required livelihood. You might get fired. So in this case, you're excused from attending. So the rationale behind that is that the subsequent hardship of any of those scenarios, losing or having damage or destruction to your property, etc., basically, is greater than one's clothing getting wet from the rain, which is an agreed upon excuse. We're going to talk about that. Because of the rain, you can forego congregation and Friday prayer if it's raining. And to have your property destroyed is a much greater hardship than you getting soaking wet. And so therefore, it's an excuse which permits you from being obliged to attend those prayers. It has been said, it should be noted, when it comes to loss or forfeiting wealth, you perceive that the wealth would be lost or forfeited in some way, it's been said that it's more virtuous to abandon that which you hope will be obtained of that wealth and pray both Friday and congregational prayers, because what is with Allah is better and everlasting. Khayrun wa abqa. Plus, your cautiousness might not even avail you. It might even save. You could be standing there at the oven and the food still burns. You could be there at that particular job and you still get fired. Right? Watching over and safeguarding the valuables, they could still be destroyed or taken or something could happen. So it said it's more virtuous to abandon that. Some have said that. However, it is certainly an excuse which does permit that. So it's one or the other. The next thing he says, أو موت قريبه أو رفيقه ومن يمرضهما. Basically here, foregoing both Jummah and congregational prayers, excused for whoever fears the death of a relative or friend, as well as whoever is caring for them. The one caring for them is the person nursing the relative or friend. So you're permitted to stay by their side so long as there is no one else that can take your place. So if you're standing there treating or caring for a close friend or a relative, or you're the caretaker or healthcare provider of someone's close friend or relative, you're permitted to miss congregational and Friday prayer because you're needed at that moment. Right? They're on their deathbed and you're going to be there. And I think that is important for healthcare providers to be aware of. If there's somebody else that can take your place, like they can come and relieve your shift, then certainly you're going to take advantage of that. Otherwise, you're permitted to take this as an excuse. He says, أو خاف على نفسه ضررا أو سلطانا أو ملازمة غريمه ولا شيء معه. The next section, he says, basically here, we're still talking about foregoing both Jummah and congregational prayer, is excused for the one who fears harm for themselves. You fear harm for yourself if you were to attend, meaning if you go from where you are to the place of congregation or Friday prayer, you might be harmed. You might get robbed. It's a known area you got to pass through. It could be difficult. Or you fear for your women folk. If you were to leave them behind, then something would happen to them. The next one, he says, from the authorities, that you are afraid of the authorities, that they might arrest you and take you in. Or the persistence of a debtor when insolvent, meaning you owe somebody money and you're unable to repay them. You have no way to repay the loan, meaning if you go, you know they'll be there waiting for you. And they may try and retain you. They may try and apprehend you. And apprehending and retaining an insolvent debtor is considered oppression. And the same ruling applies if the repayment is not due. The repayment is like it's a later due date, but you think or know they're going to come and call on their debt to be paid now, and you need to avoid that because you don't have anything to give them, or you're not ready to give it. Then, or I should say, you don't have anything to give. Then you can certainly avoid attendance. If, however, the debt is due and the debtor can afford to pay it back, meaning the one that owes the money, it's now time for you to pay it back, and you can pay it back, you're not excused from the prayer. You have to attend the congregation. You have to attend the Friday prayer. And withholding the payment of that loan withholding it while you can, that is oppression. أو فوات رفقته بسفر. So here is the next one, foregoing both Jummah and congregational prayers excused for the one who fears the loss of a travel group. The loss of a travel group. Of permissible travel. So the travel, number one, it has to have been commenced or started on permissible grounds. The journey is permissible. Or it started and it has to continue in a permissible means. Meaning you're not traveling to go gamble. This is not an excuse for you to miss congregational prayer, Friday prayer. You're not traveling to go obtain some impermissible, illicit thing, substance or otherwise. But if it's a permissible journey and you fear that if you stop to perform congregational prayer or go to Friday prayer, then obviously you are worried that your travel group will leave you and you'll be left behind, stranded and lost. You'll miss the flight, you'll miss the bus, etc. Then you're going to stay with your travel party in order to get where it is that you're going. The next one he says, "O tatwila imamin." And this is the same thing, foregoing both Jummah and congregational prayers excused for the one who fears the prolongation of the imam, which will cause hardship and harm. So the prolongation of the imam is when the imam recites lengthy recitations, and we've talked about this before. The burden that the imam can place on the congregation by reciting very long. Right? And there are some recommendations on what should be recited in the various different prayers in order to maintain moderation in leading people in prayer. And that's the job of the imam, is to be moderate when they lead people in prayer, as opposed to standing up and reading Al-Baqarah, for example. Salat al-Maghrib comes in and you're going to start, or Salat al-Isha and you're going to read Al-Baqarah. And you're going to expect that everyone's going to stand there and be okay and they don't have plans or things to do or they're not tired, and then you're just going to carry on like that. So that's a burden. And this is illustrated in the incident in which a man left the congregation of Mu'adh ibn Jabal. He started to pray. He read Surah Al-Baqarah, as I mentioned. When he began to read, the man, he basically left the congregation, prayed, and then went on his way. And that reached the Prophet ﷺ. And he didn't reprimand the man from leaving, but he reprimanded Mu'adh. And he said, are you becoming a fitna? Are you fattan? Fattanun ant basically says, are you trying to test the people? And so he instructed him to read Sabbih isma rabbika al-a'la and Washamsi wa duhaha. He said, just read these, basically. So that's another excuse. If you think the imam starts to read and you got to go, you got things, it's gonna put a burden on you, then you're excused. Oh, adhan bi matarin wa nahwihi. He says, foregoing both Jummah and congregational prayers excused for the one who fears harm from rain, etc. Etc. means mud, ice, or snow. And this is based on a narration which states, Ibn Abbas said to his mu'adhin on a rainy day, when you utter the words, I testify that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, do not say, come to prayer, hayya ala salah, but say, pray in your homes, sallu fi buyutikum. And by this announcement, the people were surprised, right? They were a little bit taken back by this command. And he said, one who is better than me has done this, meaning the Prophet ﷺ. He said, the Friday prayer is an obligatory duty, but I dislike to put you in hardship so that you have to walk in mud and rain. And you can find this hadith in Sunnah Abi Dawud. Another excuse, he says, أو غلبت نعاس. غلبت نعاس, which is overwhelming drowsiness. So foregoing both Jummah and congregational prayers excuse for the one who fears being overwhelmingly drowsy. Means they're afraid they will miss the prayer at its time or with the imam because they'll fall asleep. However, being patient and fighting off the urge to sleep is more virtuous so that you can attend. But in the event that you're overwhelmingly tired, then that would be an excuse for you to forego congregational and Friday prayers. The next thing he says, وَرِيحٍ بَارِدَةٍ شَدِيدَةٍ بِلَيْلَةٍ مُظْلِمَةٍ. He says, foregoing both Jummah and congregational prayers, excuse for the one who fears harm. This is what he says here, due to severely cold wind on a dark night. Severely cold wind on a dark night. And this is based on a hadith of Ibn Umar who said, on rainy nights, or on cold, windy nights, the Messenger of Allah ﷺ would summon his announcer, meaning the mu'adhin, to call out, perform your prayer at your camps. Sallu fi rihalikum. And this is found in Sunan ibn Majah. So this is something that was done by the Prophet ﷺ. So there's an issue here with Imam al-Bahuti rahimahullah ta'ala. He says, rihin baridatin shadida. So it's severely cold wind. So the severely part is not mentioned, right? He limits, he's basically saying like cold wind is not enough, it has to be severely cold. Can't just be cold, it has to be really cold, extremely cold. But this little limitation of being severely is not mentioned in Al-Muntaha. Of course, we talked about Muntaha al-Iradat being one of the foundational works of the madhab. And in Al-Iqna', which is the second book, those two together make up the madhab essentially. The author explicitly negated the restriction of severely cold. Just cold wind is enough, and he says even if it is not severe. If it's cold but not severely cold, just cold wind is sufficient enough an excuse to forego these prayers. So that should be noted. So it's not like we're going to have to wait until we're in the negatives to apply this ruling. But if it's cold and it's windy, it's at night, then that's an excuse enough to forego congregational prayer. Side note here is attending the masjid. Right? So we're talking about excuses for coming, means people want to come and then they'll have times in which they're excused, but there are times when it's actually disliked to attend. And one of those times is after having eaten raw garlic or onion, or anything that has a foul smell until that odor subsides, or until you do something to remove that odor, right? Whatever that may be. And this is the case even if the place is empty, due to the harm it will cause the angels. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever eats from this foul tree is not to come close to our place of prayer. So that's the masjid or the place of congregational prayer. And this is also the case for other odors, not just food-based odors, but other odors. If you have some odor on your clothing or your body, maybe you have a body odor issue happening, maybe you've just been working hard all day and it's humming, then in that case, you're excused from the congregational prayer. Go and freshen up, essentially. So that basically wraps up that section. The next section is prayer of the excused. So this is Bab al-Salati Ahl al-A'dhar. This is an entire chapter here about people that are excused in prayer in some form or fashion. Imam al-Bahuti opens this chapter, he says, تَلْزَمُ مَكْتُوبَةٌ مَرِيضًا قَائِمًا. Obligatory prayers require the ill to pray while standing, if they are capable, of course, right? Even if they're only bowing. So while they're standing, the nature of their illness or their ailment prevents them from standing fully erect, but while they're standing, it's as if they're bowing. Maybe they have a problem with their back or something's wrong with their muscles or something, so they can only stand and they are bent over, hunched over in a bowing-like position. Or they're resting or leaning on something, like a wall. They're ill and they're resting or leaning on something like a wall. They're required to do so. فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَقَائِدًا. He says, if they, meaning the ill, are unable to stand as mentioned here, or they do not stand because they're afraid it will bring about harm, increase the severity of their illness, or delay their recovery. So these are three things that you have to consider when you're going to either stand or sit in prayer due to illness or ailment, right? It's going to bring about harm. It's going to increase the severity of their illness or delay their recovery. They do so while seated. If they can sit, they're required to do so, even if they're leaning or resting on something while seated. Okay, so this is why I mentioned this, is because there's an order to what you do, how you pray based on your circumstances and the illness or the ailment that you're suffering from. Okay, so it starts with standing, and if you can't do that, then you move to sitting. Okay, because there are other scenarios. You don't jump from A to C. You have to pass by B. Okay, so the next thing is to do so while seated. And so you're required to sit even if you're leaning or resting on something, like when you were standing. If you had to lean or rest on something in order to stand, then you do that. And now you're required to sit if you can't stand, even if it means leaning or resting on something. So while you're seated, during the standing position, which is normally where everyone is standing, it's recommended that you sit cross-legged. This is the like foundation of the issue here, right? This is the origin, or I should say the starting point, is that you sit cross-legged like you're sitting now. So you're sitting on the floor and you're sitting with your legs crossed over while you're in the standing position. And then when the congregation moves into the bowing and prostration positions, you sit with your legs together underneath you, like you would normally sit in prayer. Okay? Sit with your legs folded together. And this is how a voluntary prayer is offered while seated. So we know it's permissible to sit to offer a voluntary prayer. And this is the manner of seating which is recommended. However, whichever way you sit due to this ailment or illness, it's permissible. This is the recommendation. You sit cross-legged while people are in the standing position, or while you would be in a standing position, and then you put your legs together and fold them under you while you're in the bowing and prostration positions. He says, فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِيعْ فَعَلَى جَنْبٍ. If they're unable to do that, meaning they're unable to sit, or sitting causes them difficulty, they are to lie on their side. And this is based on a hadith which the Prophet ﷺ told Imran ibn Hussein, pray while standing. If you're unable, then while seated. If you are unable, then while on your side. Imam al-Nasa'i added in his narration, if you are unable, then while laying on your back. So there you see the progression, if you will, of the positions. Imam Bahuti says, وَالْأَيْمَنُ أَفْضَلُ, and the right of which is preferred, meaning the right side. So if you're going to lie on your side, the right side is preferred, and this is based on a hadith of Ali which states if you, the ill, are not able to pray while seated, then they are to pray while lying on their right side facing the Qibla. Right, so the idea is that you're laying on your side and you're facing the Qibla. The right side is preferred. This hadith is found in Imam al-Bayhaqi's collection. So lying on the left side is permissible, and facing the Qibla while lying on your left side if you're unable to lie on your right side. If you're able to lie on the right side, but you choose to lie on the left side, this is considered makruh, it's disliked. But the prayer is still valid. He says, وَتَصِحُ عَلَى ظَهْرِهِ وَتُكْرَهُ مَعَ قُدْرَةٍ عَلَى جَنْبٍ وَإِلَّا تَعَيَّنَ وَرِجْلَاهُ لِلْقِبْلَةِ يُومِئُ رَاكِعًا وَسَاجِدًا وَيَخْفِضُهُ فَإِنْ عَجَزَ أَوْمَأَ بِعَيْنِهِ. Here in this section he says, it is valid, وَتَصِحُ عَلَى ظَهْرِهِ. It's valid, meaning for someone ill who is unable to stand or sit to pray, to do so on their back. But their prayer is disliked if they can do so on their side. Right, so now, again, this is illustrating these levels. They have to be done in order. You can't skip one and go straight to the next after it. Otherwise, if they cannot pray on their side, they are obliged to do so on their back, with their feet facing the Qibla. And this is a type of facing the Qibla, right? It's similar to facing it, while gesturing with their head to bow and prostrate. And the prostration gesture is made lower than the bowing prostration. So you would move your head up and down to gesture for bowing, and then lower for prostration. If you're unable to do that gesturing with your head, then you gesture with your eyes. Right? You would gesture with your eyes. You would lower your gaze one level and another based on what position that you're in. And in this case, you're going to be intending the action that you're doing. Another scenario would be you're unable to speak. And this may be in a scenario of fear. You're unable to speak because you don't want them to know that you're praying. You've been held captive, and you're worried that if they realize you're praying, then it might bring about some type of hardship. And so in this case, you don't even have to speak, but you intend in your heart the phrase that is supposed to be said along with the action that you're supposed to do. If you cannot gesture with your head or with your eyes, like the person that's in fear, then obviously you're going to pray in your heart. And this illustrates the point that prayer is not foregone. It's not to be abandoned totally so long as one's mental faculty is intact. Meaning you can pray just sitting, just standing, just there, without anybody knowing. If you're in a scenario which permits that, you're praying and no one has a clue that you're doing so. If you're permitted to do that. Right? It's not like, well, I'm in the office right now and I'm a little embarrassed, I'm a little shy, so I'm just praying right now in my mind. It's the difference between being embarrassed and being afraid for your safety or security. Or having the inability to do so whatsoever. The next line, he says, وَمَنْ عَجَزَ أَوْ قَدْرَ فِي أَبْنَائِهَا انْتَقَلَ إِلَى الْآخَرِ. Okay, so now we're talking about either gaining ability or losing ability during the prayer. He says, whoever becomes either unable or capable during prayer must move to the next position. They move to the next obligatory position they are capable of achieving. And that's when it comes to standing, sitting, lying on your side, or lying on your back. The ruling of which position that is based on the person's capacity. What is it that you can do in prayer? If they started while standing and then became incapable of standing, they move to the seated position. If they're unable to maintain the seated position, they move to the lying position on the side. If they're unable to maintain that position, then they move to the position on their back. And vice versa. So if now you regain some ability and you think, maybe I can sit up, then you move to the seated position and you think, okay, can I stand? If you can stand, then you would stand in the prayer. And in those moments, if you do not make that move, which is required, the prayer would be invalid. This is important to note. So basically, if you're seated in prayer and you have the ability to stand and you do not make the move to stand, then the prayer becomes invalid. من قدر على قيام وقعود دون ركوع وسجود أومأ بركوع قائما وسجود قائدا. Whoever can stand and sit but not bow and prostrate. So they're able to stand up and they're able to sit. But they can't bow and they can't prostrate due to inability. They are to gesture for bowing while standing because the orientation of one's legs is the same in those cases. While you're standing, your legs are fixed on the ground. While you're bowing, the legs are fixed on the ground. So while you're standing, you would gesture for the bowing position. And for prostration while seated, because the legs are in the same orientation. You're sitting on your legs there, right? You're seated. While you're prostrating, your legs are in the same orientation. So when you're seated, you're going to make the gesture for prostration. And doing this distinguishes the two gestures, the one for bowing and the one for prostrating. You can make a very clear distinction between which gesture is being made for what position in the prayer. It says, وَلِمَرِيضٍ يُطِيقُ قِيَامًا الصَّلَاةُ مُسْتَلْقِيًا لِمُدَاوَاةٍ لِقَوْلِ طَبِيبٍ مُسْلِمٍ ثِقَةٍ وَيُفْطِرُ بِقَوْلِهِ إِنَّ الصَّوْمَ يُمَكِّنُ الْعِلَّةِ. Says the ill who are capable of standing may pray while lying if prescribed to do so by a trustworthy Muslim physician. The ill who are capable of standing, they have the ability, they may pray while lying if prescribed to do so by a trustworthy Muslim physician. Muslim, trustworthy, look, trustworthy, he says, بِقَوْلِ طَبِيبٍ مُسْلِمٍ ثِقَةٍ. Okay, they have to be Muslim, right? So that means you can't take the prescription of a non-Muslim to lie in prayer while you have the ability to stand. Or someone that's not trustworthy. Or someone that is not knowledgeable in that area. Or a person that's a fasiq, an open sinner, even if they're Muslim. You can't take their prescription as treatment. The trustworthy Muslim physician you can take as treatment. If the doctor's upright and knowledgeable, his prescription becomes amrun dini. It becomes a religious issue, basically. It's like an edict of sorts. He's giving you a verdict here. So in that case, you can take that. If the trustworthy Muslim physician declares that fasting will exacerbate an illness, they may also break their fast if prescribed. The doctor says, look, nope, if you fast, it's going to have an impact on your health. Then you're allowed to take that prescription and break your fast. The next section deals with prayer on a ship, a vessel of sorts. He says, وَتَسِحُ فِي السَّفِينَةٍ إِذَا أَتَى بِمَا يُعْتَبَرُ لَهَا وَقَاعِدًا إِنْ عَجَزَ عَنْ خُرُوجِ مِنْهَا وَقِيَامًا بِهَا وعلى راحلة خشية تأذن بوحل ونحوه لا لمرض مع قدرة نزول وركوب ويصح النفل مطلقا. Okay, so in this section, this is the last section. He says, basically he says it, meaning the obligatory prayer, is valid aboard a vessel. So if you're on a ship, that's typically what he's saying, is safina. You're on a ship. So long as its requirements are performed, the prayer is valid. The requirements are like standing or facing the qibla. Even if it's possible to disembark, you could get off the ship, like the ship is still at the port, or it's at the dock. You're on the ship. If you can stand and face the qibla and meet all the conditions of prayer while standing on the ship, you can pray on the ship and it's valid. You don't have to get onto the ground in order to do so. It's also valid to pray on the vessel while seated if standing is impossible and disembarking is not an option. Now the ship's off to sea. There's no room to stand. And there's no way to get off. Then the prayer is valid to pray seated, even if you have the ability to, like the physical capacity, you just don't have the space to stand. The capability is not there. In this case, you pray seated and you would face the qibla and then continue to move as necessary to maintain proper direction of prayer. Congregational prayer is also to be established on the vessel even when it's not possible to stand. Like there's a bunch of you on the ship and no one can stand, you still perform the prayer in congregation, just as you would when it's possible to stand. So it doesn't really matter here whether you're all standing or not. Obligatory prayer is also valid while mounted. This was an issue I think that was brought up last time. Be it standing or underway. We're talking about sitting in a car during certain inclement weather. Due to the fear of annoyance or harm from mud, etc., such as rain, ice, and snow. Okay, we're going to talk about this a little bit. The annoyance here, he says, al-adha, ta'adhin biwahalin wa nahwihi. All right, basically harm. We'll talk about what that means. This is based on a hadith of Amr ibn Uthman ibn Ya'la ibn Murrah, who narrated from his father, from his grandfather, that they were with the Prophet ﷺ on a journey. They wound up in a narrow area when the prayer time became due. Then it began raining, essentially is what the hadith means, from the sky above. Basically says that the sky was above us, meaning the rain, and it was wet beneath them. So the Prophet ﷺ called the adhan while he was on his mount, and then the iqamah, and he went forward on his mount, still seated. He led them in salah by making gestures, making his prostrations lower than his bowing, and this was reported by Al-Athram and found in Sunnah Tirmidhi. In one of the narrations it says the Prophet ﷺ prayed while mounted, and the companions were all mounted, making gestures such that the sujood was lower than the ruku'. Is everyone following this? Okay. So we're going to expound on this a little bit, because at face value it seems like, okay, it's raining out, I'm going to sit in my car, I'm going to pray. It's snowing out, I'm going to sit in my car, I'm going to pray, and it's going to be fine. There's some things that you have to consider here. Ibn Qudama expounds on the issue in Al-Mughni, of course. We would expect it to be quite extensive. He says, if someone finds themselves in water, like rain and mud, and they cannot make sujood without getting soiled by the mud or wet from the water, their clothing, you're going to make sujood, you're going to get on the ground. If you're going to get muddy, if you're going to get wet, without getting soiled by the mud or wet from the water, they are permitted to pray on their mount and gesture for the bowing and prostration. If they are on foot, they can also gesture for the prostration. Right? So if you're standing on the ground, then of course you're going to bow because you're not going to get dirty from that. I mean, besides your shoes. I mean, that's normal though, right? You're going to still have to bow, but now you don't have to make sujood because you might, I mean, if it's terribly muddy and terribly wet, then you could get what they call adha, annoyance or harm, or something might, some of them might get damaged. So they would gesture for the prostration in place of actually prostrating on the ground that's muddied and wet. It's been reported that Anas ibn Malik prayed on his mount while in mud and water. Jabir radiallahu anhum did the same. Imam al-Tirmidhi said acting in this manner is the accordance with the people of knowledge. Imam al-Shafi'i said that it was not permissible for a person to pray while mounted due to the rain, based on a hadith of Abu Sa'id, because the bowing and prostration are pillars of the prayer which are not voided due to rain, just like the remaining pillars. Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la, he said that I asked Abu Abdullah Ad-Damaghani, this is not Imam Ahmad, Ad-Damaghani, of course Abu Ya'la was in a different era, Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la. This is one of the Imams, he says, the madhab of Abu Hanifa is to pray while mounted due to rain and illness, two things. If they're already on their mount, they're up on their horse or their camel, then you would pray due to the rain and due to sickness. Basically because getting up and down was a difficulty, getting up and down. So if you're ill, they're basically saying like it's already a burden that you're ill, and now having to get up and down from your mount creates a burden. The Shafi'i said it's not permissible to pray the obligatory prayer while mounted due to rain and illness. And both of these views have been reported from Imam Malik. Yes and no. You can and you can't. Meaning they were both reported views. And that's not absurd, because you'll find that with the Imams they would have such a thing. They reported it they said no one time, and they said yes one time based on what time it is that they said it and what they were working with their knowledge. Those who prohibit praying while mounted use the hadith of Abu Sa'id, which states, with my 2 eyes I saw the Prophet ﷺ leave, and there were traces of water and mud on his forehead and nose. And this is authentic hadith, meaning he prayed and put his face on the ground while there was mud and water. As I said, authentic hadith. Imam al-Qudami says, we, however, have the mentioned hadith an example of Anas. Imam Ahmad said, Anas prayed an obligatory prayer while mounted on a rainy day while he was heading to Sarabit. He was leaving. And this is collected by Imam al-Athram. It's also mentioned by Imam Ahmad that there are no other reports to state otherwise. Based on that hadith, there's not another hadith to state otherwise, and therefore it's considered ijma', it's a consensus. This is because rain is an excuse which permits combining prayer. It impacts the actions of prayer like travel permits shortening. Ibn Qudamah concludes that as for the hadith of Abu Sa'id, it's possible that that was done due to a minor amount of mud which would not dirty the clothes. Meaning that hadith of Abu Sa'id, where it was reported that he saw the Prophet ﷺ with mud on his nose and his forehead, mud and water. That maybe what's possible is that he did that ﷺ because it wasn't significant. The amount of mud and water was not significant enough that it would have harmed his clothing. But it would have gotten on his face and his nose. In another work called Sharh al-Kabir, I've mentioned this before, Abu al-Faraj Abdul Rahman, he's known as Ash-Sharih. He says, this is permitted, meaning praying while mounted due to mud, rain, or snow or ice, when it is in abundance, such that if they were to prostrate on the ground, it would soil the clothing and cause harm. If it is possible for them to disembark and pray while standing without any harm, they are required to do so. Because they can stand without the presence of harm, they're required to do so, just like when it is not raining. Bowing is not voided in that case, as I mentioned before, because it can be done while gesturing to replace the prostration. So you still can bow, make ruku', and then instead of prostrating, making sujood, you would use a gesture to do so due to the potential harm that would be inflicted. If disembarking from the mount will cause harm and soil the clothes, prayers performed on it as mentioned based on the stated evidence, meaning based on prayers performed on the mount. Imam al-Bahuti came to the same conclusion in Kashaf al-Qina'ah, basically reiterating the same points that were mentioned by Ash-Shari'. In Al-Mubdi', Ibn Muflih, he says, if they can disembark without harm, they are required to do so. Standing and bowing are the same while the sujood is done with gestures due to the harm that could be incurred. It has also been reported that Imam Ahmad did not permit this based on the hadith of Abu Sa'id. So you can see Imam Ahmad, there are reports that he said permissible and reports in which he said not permissible to do so. In another explanation of Al-Khiraqi, Imam Zarkashi, he said it's been reported that it is not permitted to pray while mounted because the Prophet ﷺ said, pray while standing. A person on their mount would therefore be required to disembark and pray on the ground. So you can see there's a number of opinions as it pertains to praying while seated on a mount or some vessel due to rain or mud or snow. And there are some parameters that have to be considered. There are some stipulations. So, in conclusion to this, the official madhab, you can find this as well as Al-Insaf by Al-Mardawi. He said that it is valid to pray an obligatory prayer while mounted when the mentioned stipulations are present. Meaning, the level of mud or snow or ice has to be significant enough that it will cause harm. That you couldn't even get out to stand. So imagine you're off-roading. I mean, that's the scenario that I can think of. I can't imagine that scenario on a normal street that most of us drive on, where, unless, of course, you're out there and you're going to get out of the car and you're going to get a foot into mud. If it's an abnormal condition, you're going to step out of your vehicle and you're going to be knee-deep in mud, then I can imagine you going, well, look, this is going to ruin everything. But if you're going to get out, and you're able to get out, and there's some snow on the ground, there's some mud on the ground, it's insignificant. Standing in it's not going to come up. It's not going to get on your clothes. It's going to be on your shoes where you're normally walking. Then I think in that scenario, you're required to get out. Again, unless you're going to get out and you're going to be in a foot of whatever it is, or it's going to get on the clothing, it's going to have to be significant enough, then you would be permitted to. You would be excused in that moment, like to pray while seated. Obviously, if you were able to stand, you get out and stand. And because there is some water or mud on the ground, then when it came to the prostration, then you would not be required to do so. You would gesture. And that's the same case if you were just outside walking about. You find yourself out walking about, or you're out working and there's snow or there's mud or there's water, and it's time for prayer and you can't find a place that's adequate where you wouldn't be annoyed by getting wet or harmed or your clothing being damaged, then you would obviously just avoid the prostration and make gestures to fill in that void. So that's permissible, basically. But it's not permissible due to illness. And that was the point of Abu Hanifa's madhab, in that you don't have to get down or out of your vehicle due to illness. But according to the madhab, it's not permitted due to illness because that has no impact on whether you get out or not. He says if they're capable of dismounting and mounting, basically, due to illness, right? Because in the madhab, it is permissible if you cannot get down and then get back up, right? You were able to get up there. You perhaps had help getting up. But if you get down, I won't get back up. I won't be able to get back up. In that case, you don't have to get down. And as we know, most of us, categorically, it's valid to pray while seated for a voluntary prayer. And that is where we will